everyone, and welcome to the do's and don'ts of crafting job descriptions. My name is Chris Mayfield, and I'll be the very brief facilitator and introducer uh, for this course. And I want to open it just by saying I don't want to steal your thunder, Brian, but this is probably one of the biggest overlooked aspects of hiring and recruiting and hiring the people that will ultimately stay in your organization. So I'm super jazzed about this topic, and I appreciate you taking the time to share with us. Why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Sounds good. Let me see here. All right. Do we need to do the first, or do you want me to
Yeah,
introduce
we
myself?
can absolutely do the oath first. I just was giving you an opportunity to say who you are and a little bit about
I'll,
yourself, and then we can do
yeah,
the oath.
that's the yeah. We'll skip ahead. My name is
Okay.
Brian Kinzie. My company is Tinker HR. We provide fractional HR support to uh, businesses and nonprofits, basically assisting them with whatever they need from an HR standpoint on a fractional basis. It can be putting together job descriptions, can be helping them with recruitment, retention, compliance, sticky HR situations with people, employee handbooks, all those things that HR departments do for large organizations, we do fractionally for smaller organizations. So I've been doing Tinker HR started up, I guess, about 9 years ago now. And prior to that, I had over 20 years in corporate HR roles and lots of degrees and letters and initials after my name. And no one cares about all that stuff. They just want to know that I know what I'm talking about with HR. So,
That's right. Can you
so
help me? Help me, help me.
exactly.
Yep, yep, absolutely. All right, so let's kick this off with the oath. I'll read it aloud, and you can either read it in your mind or read it aloud with me, and then we'll push on with the rest of the material. So, I, Chris Mayfield, do solemnly swear to accept the lifelong obligation to hone my superhero powers and apply those superhero powers to the good of the people I serve. I will promote and add to the ongoing success of Empower People, its members, and the people, organizations, and communities it serves. I will help prepare the next generation of superheroes. I am driven to be a positive change agent for those I serve and interact with. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Well, I will jump right into it. What we are going to try to cover today is real quickly why job descriptions are important. It's not just a paper exercise; they really do have a use. And we're going to talk about kind of the components of job description, the things that consider the guide of habits that you must include, some things you might want to consider including depending on for today. I've already talked about myself earlier, so we will not mess with that. We'll keep on going. um, all right. So getting straight into it, why are job descriptions important? Why are we actually doing these? And I'll be the first person to tell you that if you are going to take a job description, write it up, and then throw it into a drawer and never look at it again, that's probably a waste of time. That gives you a little bit of legal cover, but that's about it. And so the correct HR answer is that you should always have a job description no matter what. But I'm going to tell you, if you're just throwing it in the bottom of a drawer, you probably are just wasting your time and might not want to bother with that. But let me tell you about what it can be used for and why it's a good thing to have. First and foremost, a good job description provides a leader with clarity on what is actually expected of a role in terms of what you want to be doing and what the duties are. And that is particularly important if you're creating a new position That is vital to figure out what it is that you are trying to hire for and what role it's going to have in the organization. Um, and I always tell business owners, especially after they're making their first hires, write a job description for yourself as well. So you know what it is that you, as the business owner, are responsible for, and what the employee that you just brought into the organization, where their responsibilities begin and end. So I think that's a really useful exercise to go through to provide that kind of clarity around what's expected. Um, it gives clear outline for expectations to the employees, so they know what it is they're supposed to be doing. I was talking with a group earlier on this exact same topic, and I asked them, raise your hand if you have a job description. I think there's like one person in the room that had one. So I was like, well, how do y'all know what you're supposed to do? And they're like, well, yeah. They, so there's obviously for some employees a gap between the expectations and reality in the role. So having that written job description can kind of help close that gap. Um, it's critical for identifying the skills that are actually needed for a role when you go to hire for it. Uh, when you're putting a posting out there into the Indeeds and LinkedIn's of the world, you need to know what it is you're trying to hire for. What skills do the people really need to have? What certifications or training or degrees might they need to have to be successful in the role? And putting together that job description helps you identify what really is important and what is nice to have. So it's really good to have for that. And next thing I'm going to talk about, it's a reference point for performance management and development. So when you are meeting with the employee who maybe isn't quite getting the job done the way you'd like to see it done, it gives you a space to be able to say, okay, this is what we expected from you, referring back to job description. You're covering the first 4 bullet points, great, but bullet points 5 and 6, we need to work around. So it gives you something to true back to that both of you can look at and have a discussion around. Conversely, as people's roles change in an organization, you can look at that job description and be like, okay, yeah, when we hired you for this right here. But since then, you've tacked on 4 or 5 different things. Maybe it's time to change your role, your job title, whatever, and make it more applicable to what it is you're doing now. So that's why I think of job descriptions as a living document, not just something to throw into a drawer. The job description, I should always say this, it should be the basis of your job posting, but it should not be your job posting, because your job description itself is an internal document to your company for you and your employees to look at. A job posting is essentially a sales pitch to the world for what your organization is and what you're trying to bring into the organization to help you achieve your goals. So there should be, for lack of a better way of putting it, a little bit more salesy fluff into your job posting. And maybe you don't want to go through every single detailed task that is going to be required of this job, because you don't want to have a 3-page posting or something like that. That gets to be overkill. So you want to true back to that job description, make sure you're hitting all the key points in that job posting, but you don't want to just copy and paste it, which I see unfortunately happen a lot. And it's really, the job posting can be better, but it does give you that basis for what you're trying to hire for. And also prevents you from making hiring decisions that only might serve you in the short term. Because if you're going through that process of the job description, it also forces you to think more strategically about what it is specifically I want this person in this role to do for the organization, as opposed to hiring somebody because you like them and all that stuff, and then figuring out real quickly afterwards, oops, I really want somebody that could do X, Y, and Z, but I hadn't thought about it yet. And then, you've hired a bookkeeper, but you really needed a CFO, and you don't want to be in that situation. So
I got a question for you, Brian. I know we have some question and answer time at the end, but this just seems like a really good place to ask the question. So let's say I'm really good at strategy, right? And I clearly have an understanding of where I want my business to be in 5 years. Mm-hmm. And then I can kind of project what capabilities this person might need to develop to meet those future demands.
Yep.
Is that something that would be appropriate to put in a job description, or is that understanding that it's an internal document, um, you know, so as it stands now, and then, hey, here's the emerging requirements. Is that, would that be appropriate in there to say, here's a heads up that these are skills I'm going to need you to have in 3 years or 2 years?
If it's something where there's a clear path of development for the person, then I think that's absolutely appropriate to put in the job description. Like, here's what we need today, but 3 years from now, this position is going to evolve, and I'm going to need you to also be able to do X, Y, and Z. So what is our plan to get you from where you're at now to where I'm going to need you to be in a few years? Do I need to send you for training? Do you need to have on-the-job experience? But as long as there's a plan in place, and that's where the job description can help support the training and development for the person. So if it's clearly called out that that role is going to be evolving, that's completely fine to have in there. And I consider that appropriate. If you don't feel like the role is going to evolve, don't put something like that in there, because at that point, you're setting an expectation for something that might not be happening. And it can also be like a present state job description and then a future state job description of, here's what the job is now. In a few years, we're going to be looking for this. So if you're interested in transitioning from this job to that job, here's what you're going to need to do in the meantime. And again, that can form the basis of that kind of developmental conversation. So hopefully I answered that question. So
you did. Perfect. Thank you.
No problem. The last thing to mention here is legal considerations, which is this is kind of like, if you're just going to take that job description and throw in the bottom of a drawer, this is where that can actually be somewhat useful. If you are having a person who is asking for an accommodation for their job, for disability or something along those lines, you're required to go through what's called an iterative process to see if the accommodation is reasonable for your organization or not. So having the job description that clearly sets out what is required of the job is really, really important for being able to say, yes, we can accommodate this successfully, or no, we're not able to accommodate this successfully. Because what can be a reasonable accommodation in one role might not be a reasonable accommodation in another role. Like if I have say a 5-pound lifting restriction, okay, if I have someone who's working in an office environment and the only thing they'd ever have to do is once a week fill the copy machine, that's the only time they're ever going to have to worry about lifting more than 5 pounds in this role. Well, I can probably accommodate that. Someone else in the office can load the copier. It'll be okay. If I have someone who is working for a roofing company and their job is to lump the shingles up and down the ladder all day long, 5-pound lifting description is not that's not going to work in that job, and you can clearly show that is a core component of the job. But if you are having a person apply for an accommodation and you go through that iterative process, but they challenge it later on in court because you let them go because you couldn't accommodate it, you need to be able to true back to something to show why you couldn't accommodate it. That job description helps form the basis of that legal argument at that point. And the last thing that, from a legal standpoint, is if you're trying to figure out classification for a person, whether they should be a salaried employee or a non-exempt employee, where you'd have to pay them overtime, the duties of that job description, again, kind of help you make that argument for how they should be classed from a legal standpoint. If that was ever challenged, you'd be able to come back to that job description and say, here's what was required. This is why we decided to class them in this fashion. If you don't have that job description to refer back to, it's essentially your word against the person who's potentially filing a complaint. So job descriptions can give you a little bit of, I think the technical HR term for this is CYA. So for that. So in any case, this is why job descriptions are important. Let's move on along here. These are what I consider the kind of basic gotta have it components for what you want to have in your job description. First off, accurate job title. The job title should reflect what the person's actually doing. That sounds basic common sense, but a lot of times it's not. So accurate job title, correct classification for the job. Is it full-time, part-time? Is it Hourly, is it salary, that kind of classification information. A basic overview paragraph that outlines what the purpose of the role is, why this position is needed in the organization, what it is that we're expecting this role to accomplish. And that's kind of what I would consider to be the basis of your kind of 30-second elevator pitch of what the role is. Kind of that's where there's some crossover between what you would have in a job posting and a job description, because you're trying to have a quick summary of what this job does that could be captured really quickly with someone just skimming through. Then you have your basic section listing key responsibilities and duties, what the person's going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, what the job looks like, what you're going to expect them to be accomplishing during that area. You'll have a section outlining knowledge, skills, and abilities. So, does this require an advanced degree or something like that? Does it require a driver's license? Does it require certain types of certifications? Do you have to have, it's like if a programmer, what programming languages are required for the position? So knowledge, skills, and then abilities. That's sort of your soft skills are required for it. Like, they need to be an outstanding communicator. They need to have great writing skills, things of that nature. So the things that knowledge, skills, and abilities are required for a person to be successful in that role. Physical requirements, I already talked about physical requirements a little bit just a moment ago, but outline what those are. And then the one last thing, you always want to have the phrase, other duties may be assigned, because you don't want to ever have an employee coming back to you later on, waving a piece of paper in your face saying, this isn't in my job description, I'm not doing this. So you want to have other duties may be assigned, just so people have that expectation that, hey, this is the basic job, but there's going to be some things we ask you to do that aren't on here. And that's okay. That's totally fine. I would say to people, if you have other duties that may be assigned that the person ends up doing all the time for an extended period of time, then it's time to update that job description to reflect the new reality of what their job is. So, but always have that phrase in there. That's really, really critical. So,
one of the things that always got under my skin a little bit, I used to work for the Commonwealth, and they would have like a job title of like admin one, right?
Yes.
And that could be somebody who does accounting admin. That could also be somebody who does distribution admin. That could also be somebody who does HR admin, and they're all admin one. So you look up these and it is very confusing for most people. An admin is not just an admin. It's to your advantage to be descriptive in that job title.
Yes. I could not agree more. I know someone who worked at a large financial institution here. Their job was essentially they were a process manager coordinating the activities between the programmers and the external vendors who were selling them information, and the business analysts, and trying to get all three of those parties working together. So their job was really a process manager. Their technical title was clerical associate 3, which means absolutely nothing to anybody. It meant something within that organization's own internal HR level classification speak, but that was really just honestly a inner HR department term that meant nothing to anybody else. So, and I don't have a problem with having an internal and external job title being different to how it needs to be presented to the world, but that needs to be communicated. So I know exactly what you're talking about with that state job thing. It's like, no, that doesn't really cover what's being done here. So
not helpful.
No, not at all. Okay, probably should have components. If you're an organization that it has like established salary bands and ranges for positions, or you're open book about what your salaries are with people and what the ranges are for it, then that should be a part of the job description. Some companies like to put that information out there. I personally prefer to have that information public so people aren't speculating. But if you're an organization who wants that information available, put it out there. If you're one that wants to keep it closed for whatever reason, then obviously don't put that in there, because this should be a document being shared between the employee and management both. So don't have it out there if you don't want your employees to see it. There are a lot of times, particularly large organizations, some hierarchical information about where the position reports to, who they report to, that kind of thing can be good to have in there. Information about work environment. If it's obvious where a person's going to be working, I might not include it. But if it's has a combination of indoor or outdoor work, if it's hybrid, is it remote or is it entirely in office? That type of information can be good to include. Expected hours of the job, if it's going to have a very fixed schedule, that's a good thing to include there, just so people kind of know what the expectation is. Like, is it going to be 7 to 3:30 Monday through Friday without fail? Is it going to be we need you available 24/7 on call? I mean, that needs to be explained if it's going to be something a little bit more out of the ordinary in particular. So, if the job's going to require some travel, include what those travel requirements are. Is it going to be 1 day a week? Are you going to be 3 days a week? Is it overnight? Kind of just set that expectation up front. You don't want to have somebody thinking they're signing on for a job that doesn't require travel, and the next thing they know, they turned into a road warrior on you. That's probably not going to work for their lifestyle. It may, but you want to communicate that kind of thing up front and have that expectation set. And then finally, a little bit on the magnitude and scope of responsibility, decision making, or spend authority can be really useful. I always use the example like the job title vice president of sales. Well, that might be a perfectly good job title within your organization, but a VP of sales that's selling $50,000 worth of widgets is not the same VP of sales that's selling $5 billion worth of widgets. So those are completely different jobs and different roles. So if there's going to be magnitude and responsibility that needs to be spelled out, this is a good place to include that. And then finally, a little bit here on aligning the job description with the culture of the organization. And I'll say I don't think a lot of companies do a really good job with this. And I'll be upfront, and I probably haven't always done the best job of this myself, putting together job descriptions, because you start getting focused on tasks and you kind of start forgetting about that. But it's really critical, especially in that overview section, that 30-second elevator pitch, is to include how that position that you're hiring for or have on staff supports the overall mission of the organization. How is it that this job is important to what the organization is trying to accomplish? So the person who's looking at it can look at it and be like, okay, this is why they need this position. This is why I'm important to the organization. Here's what the expectation is for how we're going to support the mission. So I think that that's really good to include. I think it's particularly effective in a job posting situation as well. And also, again, from a leadership standpoint, gives you a little bit of mental clarity on what it is you're truly expecting of that role and what it's going to accomplish for you. So, and then under that responsibility section, try to include some specific duties that are required of the role and how it's going to align with and support the culture and mission. You don't want to just have a list of very technical, tactical duties with no real loop back to why this is important to the organization. So you want to kind of include that in the responsibilities. And then finally, in that soft skills section under the KSA, knowledge, skills, and ability part of the thing, that's where you want to include the soft skills and the behaviors that you want to see that are going to support the culture and the mission of the organization. And that can be wildly different depending on the company that you're working for. If you have a company where you want somebody who's that hard charging, nose to the grindstone kind of work attitude, because that's your company culture, include that kind of information in that soft skills. If you're a company where, having sort of a, for lack of a better way to put that, arms around each other, kumbaya kind of feeling, put in this information in that soft skill section about being really important to work well with others and things like that. But those soft skills are where you can really help communicate to the employees and applicants both what is the culture of that organization is and what skills they need to have to be able to support that culture of the company. So I think that's a really important thing to think about when you're putting these together. That I think that as HR professionals, we don't necessarily do a great job of all the time, but it really is important. It's something that I make a very conscious effort these days to be aware of when I'm pulling these things together. So that's a little bit about aligning culture. Go right ahead.
I, if you're the hiring manager or the leader hiring that those types of skills, maybe that's not best. You're not best served by having your HR person do that without your input, right? You shouldn't be
Yes.
asking your HR person, hey, write the cultural skills or the behavioral skills that is going to make someone successful working for me, right? Or working within my part of the organization. So that maybe isn't something we want to ask HR to do kind of in a vacuum.
That's something that, I mean, from an ideal perspective, you know, I like job descriptions to be sort of a joint venture between the employee, the third party HR person, and the manager, all three of them kind of working on it together. Um, Frankly, I don't want my managers having to sit down and spend 2 hours typing up a job description. That's probably not the most effective use of their time. That's where I want the HR person to come in, have those meetings, facilitate those conversations, and be asking the questions like, what do they need to do from a cultural standpoint to work within your team successfully? And also, that's another reason I like to talk to the employees directly about what is it you actually do, because sometimes what the employees think their job is and what the manager thinks the job is, you'd be surprised how often there's a gap between the two, where sometimes you have an employee who's doing things the manager has no idea that they're actually involved with. And then other times you have a manager who's expecting these things from the employee, and the employee doesn't know that that's expected. So that's why it's important to kind of bring all the parties together at the table, or even meet separately. Doesn't matter. I mean, kind of lots of different. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. The main thing is to get all the feedback from everybody, and then come up with something at the end everyone's on the same page with at the end. So it's a really good point. So, all right, wrapping up with things to avoid. There are certain things you don't want to do when you're putting these together. First and foremost, you don't want to try to list every single task in nitty gritty detail that the person does. Um, in general, I try to follow it like roughly like a 10% rule. If they're going to spend 10% of their time or more on a task, throw it in the job description. If it's less than that, then don't bother to put it in there, unless it's a really critical task. You know, if you got something that, okay, maybe I'll only run payroll like twice a month and it only takes me an hour. Well, that's less than 10%. But if you don't run payroll, that's going to be problematic. So you want to include something like that in there. But you don't want to list like, okay, they walk in the morning, they turn on the coffee machine, they press the red button on the coffee machine, they grind. You don't need to go to that level. I've seen somewhere they tried to go to that level. That's not a job description. The one thing that I've also seen is where they're only listing specific tasks the person does, but they neglect to show areas of responsibility. So if you got too task oriented, you can forget the fact that like, well, this person supervises this team. They're responsible for the output of that team. That needs to be a part of the job description as opposed to just listing through the tactical things they do on a day-to-day basis. So make sure you're hitting both specific tasks as well as responsibilities there. Including qualifications aren't really necessary. You know, your classical thing like, well, I need a degree for the person to do this job. Maybe, maybe not. So if it's really required, make sure you have it. But if it's not really required, then put it in as a nice to have, but don't make it something that you have to have. Jargon soup. If there's a whole bunch of acronyms and letters and abbreviations that nobody except for someone completely embedded in your organization is going to be able to understand, try to cut that stuff out. I already talked about you don't want to have the job description and the job posting be identical documents, so I'm not going to get into that more. Just remember they have different purposes. You don't want to set unrealistic expectations for a role. Sometimes you'll see this where like, this role is going to be, transforming this organization, blah, 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 all that stuff. It's like, if that really is what the role is going to do, then great, include it. But, maybe the person who's like 10 levels below the CEO is not the person you want to be tasking with transforming the entire organization's culture. It's kind of hard to do that when you're an assembly line worker who's punching widgets out. It's like, let's keep that in check. Let's be realistic about what you're expecting from it. Avoid discriminatory language. You will see job descriptions sometimes that will drop in like, he does blah 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 blah, or she does blah 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 blah, which is obviously excluding other genders. So avoid anything to be considered discriminatory. There's lots of ways you can get yourself in trouble with that, but that's a different topic here. But just watch out for anything that could be considered discriminatory language. You don't want to never revise or review the job description. Like I said, it should be a living document, and finally, it should be shared with the employee, not just something that the company holds to its chest and doesn't want to share. Because it should be something that is used as a tool between both management and employees to be on the same page together and working towards the same goals. So those are the things to try to avoid when you are pulling these together. And in summary, have job descriptions, have them for everyone in the organization. And that includes you, managers and owners. Make sure you have them for everybody so you know what your roles are and what your responsibilities are. Whenever possible, you want to build them with everybody involved, not just the supervisor, but include the employee. Align the job with the mission of the organization. And again, don't post the job description as an ad, and review them and use them as living documents. So, questions?